Greetings, everyone. So today we're going to continue on our lecture series on the history of the Christian church through the Middle Ages. So now we're going to take a look at focusing on the Carolingian period, roughly from the 7th to the 9th centuries, and diving into the development of the church in that time period. So a little background reminder, remember the Western Roman Empire fell roughly around 476, depending on your viewpoint, with the last Roman emperor being deposed in the West, the rise of different Germanic kings like the Goths and the Franks and such. And from that 5th to 7th century, there was the development of these different Frankish kingdoms, or different Germanic kingdoms. And what we're going to do is look at the Franks because they play a pivotal role in setting up life and culture in the medieval period, stretching from France to modern day Germany and having some impact in northern Italy as well as the British Isles. So there are, and without doubt, an important period and important groups of individuals to look at. So the Franks moved from Germany and settled into what's now considered France today, Roman Gaul, then established themselves as a Catholic kingdom under Clovis, and Clovis was part of the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingians conducted a series of campaigns of expansion throughout France and grew in power and strength. But by the end of the 6th and into the 7th century, the Merovingians began to lose power. Different causes for this. One is as the Merovingian king died, they would divide their realm among their children, and which would cause the periods of civil war where they'd be reunited together. So there was a gradual weakness there. There was also a growing strength of the nobility, as the nobility began to challenge the power of the Merovingian kings. And ultimately, one position rose to cement control over the Merovingian court, and that was the mayors of the royal palace. Now, the mayors of the royal palace acted as a mixture of like a chief of staff today and a prime minister. They're the ones who can determine who could and couldn't see the king. They directed all policy. They made appointments for different regions, for governors in a sense, and bishops. So they really held the major power within the court of the Merovingian king. One family in particular was the Carolingians, established by Pepin, who, as the mayor of the royal palace, really held that control and that influence. We saw an important figure when we looked at the history of Islam last time was Charles Martel. He was a mayor of the royal palace who helped, as the Franks, stop the Islamic armies at the Battle of Tours, turning them back in 732. In this time period as well, we still have a massive missions movement from the British and Irish monks traveling across Western Europe, more specifically like Willibrord and Boniface, who play a role in Christianizing parts of Germany today, in that Central European region. So as the Frankish kingdom began to grow in strength and power, even at the cost of the Merovingian king's power and influence, the bond between the papacy and the kingdom of Franks grew closer together. This was due to different reasons. One was the Byzantine control over Italy began to decrease with the rise of the Lombards, another Germanic tribe in northern Italy. The papacy was looking for another kingdom to counterbalance the influence of the Byzantine court in the city of Rome and the Vatican. And so there began to be a tie, the bonds between the papacy and the Franks began to grow closer and closer, especially when Pepin, the son of Charles Martel, as the mayor of the royal palace, sought support from the papacy to remove the last Merovingian king. And so he got that in 751 with Pope Zacharias. So this is the first instance where we see a pope depose a monarch and install another one, giving that apostolic authority of removing one king and appointing another king. So Pepin is now the Carolingian king of the Franks. And in turn for this support of appointing Pepin as the king of the Franks, Pepin in turn supports and protects the papacy. For example, he invades and defeats the Lombards in a series of battles and campaigns. And those cities that he acquires goes over to the the Pope, and so creates the Papal States. So now the Pope has its not only religious jurisdiction but also civil jurisdiction, where the Pope can now administer the lands in the kind of the central part of Italy today, which is now just the Vatican City. But at the time, it was formed like kind of like a letter H looking shape within central Italy. So this donation of Pepin was important, but also another document appears as well in this time period, which is called the Donation of Constantine. This document is what's going to be used by the papacy to kind of browbeat the monarchs of Europe. And in this Donation of Constantine, it's a supposed letter from Constantine back in the 4th century, where Constantine thanks Pope Sylvester for curing him of his leprosy, and in turn gives him the administrative duties and the lands over the Western Roman Empire and control of the city of Rome, and declaring that the Pope is greater than the emperor. This document, like I said, is going to be used as a means of keeping the kings of Europe in check until it's found out that it's a forgery 700 years later, when during the Renaissance, where studying manuscripts and their origins and writings and stuff, they'll find flaws within the letter of the Donation of Constantine itself, and declaring it completely a forgery. So Pepin dies in 768 and once again divides his territories between his two sons, Carloman and Charles. Long story short, Carloman dies, and Charles regains complete control of the Frankish lands. And we know him today as Charles the Great, or more simply as Charlemagne, who will have a huge impact guiding Europe into that medieval period and laying the foundations for what we understand of medieval Europe. We're really focusing on the military campaigns on this slide and looking at his campaigns of conquest. For the 43 years of him ruling, 30 plus to 40 years of it was spent fighting and conquering someone. So, for example, he conquered northern Italy, conquered the Lombard kings there, gaining the Iron Crown of the Lombards. He invaded into Spain, conquering the Spanish borderlands as far as Barcelona, or at least his son did, Louis the Pious. And he also waged a campaign against the Saxons in northern Germany. Now, this campaign was the longest and most brutal. It lasted for 30 years, and it was constantly him marching in, force converting some of the Saxon tribes. They would convert, they'd be baptized, he would leave, they would revolt, return to the pagan ways, and he would have to come back in and burn down towns and villages and stuff, and force convert, leave again. And so it was almost a guerrilla warfare of constant campaigning over and over again. The brutality of this campaigns convinced Charlemagne eventually in 797 to outlaw the death penalty for paganism because of these forced brutality, these forced conversions. But it would help eventually, as with the resettlement of Franks into these territories, bringing in northern Germany and parts of Central Europe into Frankish control, as well as spreading Christianity into those lands. Because of these campaigns of conquest, Charlemagne was recognized as Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 AD. Now, what's interesting is that the historical accounts say that Charlemagne had no clue what was going to take place that day, which seems very unlikely. Historians are on either side of the issue. Pope Leo needed a favor from Charlemagne on a particular matter regarding perjury and such, and Charlemagne came to his defense. And so, as a way of recognizing Charlemagne's support, he crowned him the Emperor of the Romans. Now, this greatly upset the Byzantine emperors in the East. At this time, it was ruled by Empress Irene, who wasn't recognized as the empress as she was ruling through her son. So the Byzantines were slighted and would eventually recognize Charlemagne as a brother. The Byzantine emperors would recognize him as a brother emperor in the West. But Charlemagne ultimately would be crowned this Roman emperor of the Romans, and would lead to the formation of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the crown will eventually go to one of his grandsons, and then the Holy Roman Empire will begin to formulate into this kind of Germanic confederation later on in Central Europe. But in the meantime, it's just the title that's used to describe him as this reunifier of Western Christendom. But it does have a big impact splitting the Eastern and Western churches and Christendoms apart further and further. During Charlemagne's reign, there was a renaissance that began to take place. It was impacted by the fact that Charlemagne had a deep drive for intellect and education, and a desire for expanding the intellectual capabilities of the people in his territories and his kingdom. He had an interest in developing that aspect of his empire. And so he began to invite to his court all these different scholars from the different parts of Western Europe, from Britain, from Spain, from Italy. He invited them to his court. Unfortunately for these scholars, they had to travel with him on campaign constantly. So it was very difficult for them to, really focus on particular intellectual tasks. But nonetheless, when the campaigning season stopped, they would have much more time to focus. One important individual that would definitely shape the Carolingian Renaissance is a man named Alcuin of York. He would be part of Charlemagne's court for 22 years. And in that time period, he makes a different series of contributions. One is he develops the Carolingian minuscule, which is kind of like a type font system that we somewhat use today in our writings and readings. He orders the building of libraries attached to monastic communities, these expansion of these libraries, which would contribute to the writing and copying of manuscripts. Some historians say that roughly about 50,000 different manuscripts or books were produced within the 9th century alone. He also standardized and updates the Vulgate as well. So all these are contributing factors to this intellectual drive that appears in the Carolingian Renaissance and afterwards. Charlemagne also cares about the education of his people, and he orders a decree that all parish churches should provide a school for the boys in the neighborhood. This was obviously impossible really to enforce, but it does show that there was a deep focus for education. Alcuin is also appointed the head of the Royal Academy in Aachen, which is the capital of the Frankish Empire. Alcuin really kind of cements how priests and clergy, as well as secular clergy, would be educated, focusing on the trivium, quadrivium that was developed by Boethius. Remember, the trivium is rhetoric, grammar, logic. Quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And then also focusing on making sure priests are educated in knowing things like the creeds, the mass, sacramentary, which is a list of scheduled list of prayers or prayers involving certain liturgies, as well as the lectionary, which was required calendar scripture reading, as well as the homilies or sermons of early church fathers. So there was a huge expansion of trying to drive clergy education upwards. That'll have an impact later on. Now, Charlemagne did view himself as a sacred king, in a sense of like King David or King Josiah, kind of like one of the Old Testament kings. He viewed himself as someone who not only had authority in the political realm, but also in the religious realm as well. So if we look at his decrees in this time period, a lot of them are folk driving a religious content versus a political content. In a sense, Charlemagne kind of had no choice, in a sense, because it's his worldview, but also the people he relied upon were the bishops. The bishops were the only few individuals who were educated. So a lot of bishops, he appointed bishops to their offices, but he also utilized them for certain offices for managing domestic affairs, political affairs of his empire, so that bishops served dual roles. It wasn't uncommon for bishops to complain that they had to march on campaign against the Muslims with Charlemagne, and fight in battle during the day, working their sword, and then at night working their pens, having to study and write as a bishop. So they're complaining about the dual aspect of their nature. What's interesting too is, like I said, Charlemagne is really invested into appointing bishops in this time period. And one is that to maintain control across his empire. He doesn't want local bishops being chosen locally by the nobility and by the people, who can in turn potentially turn against him. Nobles still are a key component of managing his empire. He wants to maintain friendly terms with them, but also doesn't want to give them too much power and influence. Later on, the papacy is going to want to step in and want to play a role in the appointment of those bishops as well. But like I said, in this time period, bishops were appointed by Charlemagne, as well as playing a dual role, managing the affairs of the church as well as managing the affairs of the empire. Charlemagne does have like I said, he has that Christian worldview where he understands that, for example, that things like famines or plagues are judgments by God for the sin of him or his people, and so he orders public fasts. He makes Sunday a day of observance. He makes tithes compulsory and universal across his empire, so everybody has to give a tenth of what they produce, whether it's livestock, hay, corn, wine, whatever it might be, but they have to give it up. And the reason why, too, is because of the expansion of the parish churches across the Frankish Empire. You have all these parish churches that are now appearing. They are going to be run by the priests and the clergy. So you need to have money and an income to pay for these parish churches to get them this large expansion network up and running. Originally, remember, like I talked about in the earlier lectures of the early church, the western part of the Roman Empire had urban centers and had churches in those urban centers, but it was very, very difficult in the rural areas. So the Western Empire was much more rural than it was in the East. And so with the decline of the Roman Empire, you had a decline of cities. And so with the decline of cities, you had a decline of church cities as well. So in response to that, you see the rise of parish churches because there's a heavy focus of agrarianism in the society. Eventually, that begins to change with the rise of cities, as we see in the late Middle Ages. But in the meantime, right now, the parish network, the small churches that have baptistries and cemeteries, began to appear and flourish across the Frankish Empire. There are controversies that appeared during Charlemagne's reign and around that 7th and 9th century. One controversy is the adoptionist controversy that appears. So the adoption controversy involves, how do you understand as Christ is the Son of God? And it goes back to understanding Christology. Remember, in the second lecture, Early Church History Part 2, the Council of Chalcedon solidifies the Orthodox view that Christ is one person with two natures, fully human, fully God. The question now becomes, okay, how do we understand Christ as the Son of God? Well, the adoptionist controversy was Christ was eternally known as the Son of God, but was adopted as the Son of God in his human nature. This, of course, was opposed and condemned by the Council of Frankfurt in 794. And the question had to be addressed, where does Christ's sonship belong? Does it belong to his nature, or does it belong to his person? And Alcuin of York argued that the Father and Son shared the same nature, same divine essence. Therefore, the sonship belongs to his person, the one person. Because ultimately, if you ascribe it to his human nature, you create a second person, and therefore you fall into the Nestorian heresy. And so this controversy appeared and had to be addressed by the different Frankish leaders and Western bishops. Now, Charlemagne, like I said, viewed himself as a sacred king, someone similar to the Byzantine emperors. Remember, in the East, unlike in the West, the Byzantine emperors really set the church policy and regulated the affairs of the church. The Patriarch of Constantinople was not like the Bishop of Rome or the Patriarch of Rome, and could not stand in opposition to the emperor without suffering severe consequences. In fact, the Patriarch of Constantinople, as well as many other bishops, were appointed or at least had to get approval from the emperor, the Byzantine emperor. The Byzantine emperor played a role in the election of and consecration of those individuals. Even the Bishop of Rome, prior to this point, when the Byzantines controlled Italy, had to get approval from the Byzantine emperor, but that began to change with the rise of Charlemagne and the Frankish kingdom. Now they no longer sought the support of and the need of having Byzantine approval to become emperor. Now, Charlemagne, like I said, viewed himself as someone who should be like the Byzantine emperor, should play a role in the approval of the appointment of bishops, approval of who the next pope was going to be. It had the right and duty to interfere into the affairs of the church. It was his duty as a sacred king to manage the affairs of the church. And this will create controversy and conflict with the papacy, and after Charlemagne's death into the medieval period as well, between the powers and influence of the church and the state. Some examples of this conflict: one is the iconoclastic controversy in 790. We'll talk about that in the next lecture of the Byzantine court, dealing with icons in the church. Ultimately, the Second Council of Nicaea around 789, I think, addressed the issues of icons, allowing for icons to be in the church and such. And Charlemagne was miffed that the Frankish bishops were not invited to the Second Council of Nicaea, and instead decided to formulate his own ruling on the matter, declaring that they aren't going to go along and say that the icons should be worshipped or venerated, nor can icons conduct any form of miracles. But icons can adorn the church as a means of education and inspiration. This greatly upset the Byzantine emperor. It also greatly upset the Bishop of Rome, who was trying to placate both sides, and didn't like that Charlemagne was interfering in the affairs of these religious matters. And then once again, later on, Charlemagne introduces a decree inserting the Filioque clause into the Nicene Creed. Remember, the Nicene Creed came out of the Trinity debates in the 4th century. And the Nicene Creed goes that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. By this point, by the 6th, 7th century, began to include the Western Christian bishops began to include the phrase "and from the Son." So the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. And Charlemagne kind of submits this as, yes, this is going to be now the permanent addition to the Nicene Creed. This upsets the Byzantine court, who declared that, one, you can't make any unilateral changes to an ecumenical creed without ecumenical support across the entire Christendom, and second, you're theologically wrong. It was their argument. There's incorrect, and they go through the argument. Pope Leo was kind of like, once again, caught in the middle. He agreed with Charlemagne theologically, just didn't like what the actions that Charlemagne was taking. And remember, the papacy viewed Charlemagne as subordinate to them, especially as they're the ones that crowned him as the emperor of the Romans and appointed his father, Pepin, as king of the Franks. So therefore, they viewed themselves as superior to the kings of the Franks and in their positions of power. So like I said, this relationship between the papacy and the Carolingian Franks is they have to be united to work together, but there's also division being in place at this moment because there's different goals. The papacy wants to maintain its independence. It doesn't want to be dictated to either by the Byzantines or by the Franks or by any kingdom in particular. They want to have their own level of independence, but at the same time too, they don't have the power for security, for defense, in the ways that the Frankish kings do or the Byzantines do. They are limited in what means they can pull together for security, for protection. So they have no other choice but turning to the state for protection. So there's this tenuous balance there of trying to bring the state in under control underneath them while working with them. Charlemagne has the opposite view, in that it's his responsibility as a king, kind of in the sense, the early formula, kind of like divine right of the king, that he's appointed by God to shepherd not only the secular aspects of his kingdom, but also the spiritual welfare of his kingdom, and that he had the right to regulate the church. So this laid the groundwork for that potential conflict between the religious and the political that we're going to see constantly appear, like, for example, the lay investor controversies later on in the medieval period. So developments and changes in Western worship. So because of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was definitely a decline in the education of the clergy. So one of the positive aspects of Charlemagne's reign is that Carolingian Renaissance that began to then develop the education of the clergy to make it up to standard. The clergy, because of their limited knowledge and education, really began to focus on the liturgical and sacramental aspects of worship. So, for example, what songs are being sung, following the proper scripture reading, the proper songs for mass, and etc. there was the focus began to shift in the worship, where it used to be on two things. It was on the sermon, the preaching of the word, and the sacrament, to simply only the sacrament. The sacrament, especially communion, became the center point of worship. Doesn't mean that sermons disappeared entirely, but what began to happen was that they began to read homilies or sermons from previous church fathers. There, like I said, there wasn't a complete absence of their own sermon development and writings. There are many different bishops and abbots and such who wrote their own sermons. Then there were preachers, like we'll look at the different mendicant orders. But really the clergy began to have a strong emphasis on that liturgy and on that sacramental function. There was two different liturgies at this time. There was the Gallican liturgy and the Roman liturgy. Ultimately, the Roman liturgy won sway across Charlemagne, became the standard across Charlemagne's empire, became the standard across Western Christendom. In the East, that would be the Constantinopolitan liturgy that became the center point of Eastern Orthodox worship. And we'll talk about that in another lecture. So like I said, the communion or the Eucharist became the center point of worship. The participation of eating the bread and wine, eating the body of Christ, drinking his blood, became the center point and the focal point of worship. Remember, it's kind of multifaceted, because one, you have the decline of the education of the clergy, but also the education of the laity was limited too. So you had to be able to convey through these means what the purpose of Christ's death and his resurrection was, and also the understanding of grace began to change. It would still follow the Augustinian view of grace, but began to apply much more so in that grace is gradually bestowed upon you through these sacraments, through doing these things. So the viewpoint of grace began to kind of slowly begin to change and transform itself to what we would recognize more and more so in the medieval period. How the laity participated in communion also began to change. In the early church, everybody participated. It was done every Sunday. Everybody would bring bread and wine. It would be shared communally across the whole church. By the 5th century, it began to become less and less frequent for the laity, for the congregants to participate in communion. And then by the 6th century, it was only done 3 times a year, where the laity would participate. It was still done every Sunday, but the parish priests were the only ones who would partake of it. The laity would only partake 3 times: at Easter, Pentecost, and then Christmas. And then eventually it was just Easter for the laity. So the reasons why this began to change was 2. One is that the fear and reverence of the body and blood of Christ, that this is God itself and transformed, and there was all these kind of rules involvement. You eat a bread and a crumb falls to the floor, and a rat eats it or something. What happens then? And so there was a sense of dread and fear for what these transforming of these elements into the body and blood of Christ. And then second off was the clergy elevated the standard of those who could participate in it, almost to the near impossibility of any laity partaking of it. And so over time, because the standards became so high, it began to become more common that people would just not partake and simply view it, and have that only one time in a year, have that special participation of the communion service. There's also a shift in liturgy where so now you had different masses taking place. So in the 8th century, what ended up happening was that on Sunday you would have the high mass. So this liturgical mass was simplified in its form, but it had singing. It was very involved from all participants who would partake in the mass celebration, following the liturgy, following the singing and the reading and such. So everybody in the whole community would be participating in the parish churches or the cathedrals of the high mass. That was done particularly on Sundays. On the weekdays, you would have the low mass, which was only performed by the priests. No singing was conducted. It was conducted in a very low voice. Very, very silent, low mass. But the lay people could participate, but only in a devotional sense. They could attend, but they couldn't be physically participating in the service. They could watch and observe and pray and meditate, but they could not involve themselves with the low mass. So it was a sense of trying to have a weekday service for the people to participate in the celebration of Christ's sacrifice. So looking at some important reformers that appear in this time period as well. So you have Benedict of Anion. He was a Frankish soldier who had a drowning accident, and then through that accident became a monk. And he had a very strict mindset of what a monk should be and do. So in 779, he founded his own monastery, but his rules were so strict that everybody left his monastery. Because of his focus and dedication and his piety, he drew the influence of Charlemagne's future son, Louis the Pious. Louis the Pious allowed him to build another monastery and granted him freedom from all secular control. And so monasteries, in a sense, began to be outside the power and influence of the secular authorities and only had to answer to the papacy and the Bishop of Rome, because they eventually acquired their appointments that way. So Benedict, what he does is he takes the rules of Saint Benedict of Nursia from the 5th century, 5th and 6th century, to standardize it across all monasteries throughout the Frankish Empire, Frankish Kingdom. Especially in 817, he tries to kind of formulate a council to have the standardized approach across all aspects of monasteries. Unfortunately, it doesn't outlive him. He dies in 821. But nonetheless, this influence of having a standardized monastic rule through the rule of St. Benedict becomes commonplace and eventually amplified with the Cluniac revival 100 years later. Some other important controversies, one in particular, the predestination controversy. Now, Augustinianism is still a key component of Western medieval theology, especially with dealing with grace, sin, the sacraments, the church, even predestination. So Gottschalk was placed in a monastery by his father, the monastery of Fulda, which was kind of this, which was a up and coming center of religious education in Germany. It was run by a man named Rabanus Maurus, a very well-educated man. Gottschalk kind of ran afoul of him when he wanted to leave the monastery and actually renounce his vows. So Rabanus was kind of offended by it, and instead just simply allowed him to leave and go to another monastery. Gottschalk was ordained to the priesthood and really began to study the theologies and writings of Augustine, especially dealing with things like predestination and grace. And so became enthralled with the law of Augustine's writings, and in comparison with the writings of Paul, began to teach the views of double predestination that God determines through election and reprobation. And so he begins to kind of have a series of followers, and his viewpoints begin to spread, and he comes into conflict with Rabanus, who opposes and condemns what Gottschalk is teaching. And Gottschalk doesn't do any favors by accusing Rabanus of being a semi-Pelagian. So ultimately, there's a conflict that breaks out within the Frankish Empire, and they formulate a council of Mainz in 848, where Gottschalk has to defend his views. The problem is that the key figure at this council is a man named Hincmar of Reims. Hincmar is one of those figures in church history that's unfortunate, because he has a very brutish mentality of managing the affairs of the church, and without the sense of charity and respect for overemphasis on discipline, without the charity and respect that comes with it. So he, in a thuggish way, kind of demands that Gottschalk, he demands that, or orders that Gottschalk be arrested, lives his life in the monastery, is tortured to the end of his life, and Gottschalk will be driven insane, being forced to live in this monastery, but refuses to recant of his positions. So because of the actions of Hincmar, the controversy grows even further because of this brutal treatment of Gottschalk. And many people agree with Gottschalk and began to support his views. And so there's many church councils between 853 and 859 on this issue of predestination. And ultimately, they try to compromise at the Council of Tausig in 860, where Hincmar's semi-Pelagian views went out. But Augustinian predestination continues still to thrive against the semi-Pelagian viewpoint in the church, and will play a pivotal role, especially later on with the writings of Aquinas and others, the Bernard of Clairvaux, and eventually into the Reformation itself. So it's not over at any point, but it really shows that the church controversies, are like what the adoptions controversies, are still constant appearance throughout church history. Another controversy is involving the Eucharist. How do we understand how does the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ? What is the meaning of that? In the early church, it was understood in the sense that when partaking of the bread and wine, it was considered the body and blood of Christ. How it was considered, it was a mystery. So most of the early church didn't really want to delve into the mystery, but just simply declaring it as such. Some different groups began to emphasize different points. So, for example, like Ambrose, the Ambrosian point is that really focusing on its conversion, that the physical reality of the bread and wine changes into the body and blood of Christ, versus the Augustinian viewpoint, once again, where it's much more so of it being a sign or symbol of Christ's body or blood. So in this Carolingian period, you had two different viewpoints appear up and conflict with one another, one being Radbertus, who wrote in the Concerning the Body and Blood of the Lord that the bread and wine completely convert as a physical reality into the body and blood of Christ. Though believers partake of it in a spiritual sense and unbelievers do not, it's just simply bread and wine to them. This view was backed up by Hincmar. Now, another figure named Ratramnus appears to write and contradict Radbertus's views, arguing that the physical reality doesn't change, that this is still the bread and wine that remain, but really there's a spiritual undertone, a spiritual conversion that's only available to believers. And this view opposed Hincmar's view. Now, ultimately, there was no solution to this viewpoint. These viewpoints were just kind of generally accepted, but gradually over time, more and more did Western Christendom drift along to Radbertus's thinkings against Ratramnus, which ultimately will culminate finally back in what we see in the Reformation period, bringing up understanding the sacrament of communion and the bread and wine and the body and blood of Christ. Some other important figures. One is John Scotus Erigenia. He was from Ireland, very important Irish thinker, very intelligent, was made head of the Royal Academy in 843. He himself was brought in to address numerous controversies. Hincmar kind of invited him in. He was involved in the predestination controversy. He opposed Gottschalk on predestination, but he did oppose Hincmar on the communion controversy, to Hincmar's chagrin. And so agreed with Ratramnus on understanding of communion. John Scotus had a very Neoplatonic understanding of the world, thanks to reading Pseudo-Dionysius's work. And in the Pseudo-Dionysius's writings have a Neoplatonist viewpoint as well. And because he takes his work and converts it over into Latin, which will later influence Western thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, it really shapes his worldview as well, especially in his writings like The Division of Nature in 862, where ultimately he kind of argues that when you're reading scripture, when it comes to understanding theology and reason, if there's a contradiction between the two, you can only interpret theology from an allegorical perspective. The problem, what got him in trouble was that his writings in the Division of Nature had a slight undertone of pantheism, that God was in everything, this Neoplatonic emanation with Christian creation. And so a lot of individuals viewed his writing as heretical. And eventually his works would be destroyed and burnt in 1225 by Pope Honorius III, but he is kind of a standout as an intellectual thinker that appears in this time period. Another important figure is Agobard of Lyons, who gives kind of perspective of what popular culture was like in Western Christendom. He was born in Spain, immigrates to France, and becomes an archbishop in 816. He runs into trouble because of the lay investor controversy, which a short summary is that ultimately, who has the power to invest bishops with their authority? Is it the secular rulers, or is it the Bishop of Rome? Who has the power? And so he sided with the Bishop of Rome, having that power to invest other bishops and appoint other bishops, which got him removed as the archbishop. So since he didn't placate the lay rulers, though he was a prolific writer whose writings can fill up to 22 different volumes, covering different things from heresy to paganism to Judaism. But like I said, what's important about him is he kind of gives a snapshot of what popular culture was like. And remember, because of the limited knowledge and education in this time period, and also this is very agrarian society, there was the undertones of pagan magic and pagan belief that had an impact within the church. And so, for example, in his writing concerning Hail and Thunder, he talks about how these people would, when this bad storm would appear, instead of relaying it over to God's providence, that bad storm appears, would believe evil spirits are what's driving the bad storms and can only use magic to help prevent the bad storms from taking place. Agobard kind of seeks to address things from a rationalist perspective, and addressing problems around the world in that kind of clear intellectual thinking. So there is, like I said, there are individual thinkers in this time period who are standouts in their thoughts and how they view the world. So after Charlemagne dies, the kingdom goes to his son, and the crown of the Holy Roman Empire goes to his son Louis the Pious, who tries to kind of maintain the level of influence and power like his father did. He was a capable ruler, but not the same level. Ultimately, he dies in 843, and his empire, as you can see in the map, breaks apart, because following the Frankish practice of when you die, you divide up your lands among your legitimate children. So his son, Louis the German, receives the Eastern territories, which is when the map is colored green, and that was what we consider modern day Germany. His other son, Charles, gets the Western Frankish lands, which is on the map colored orange, which we know as modern day France. And then his other son, Lothar, gets the strip of land from the Netherlands to Italy, as well as the crown of Holy Roman Emperor. Lothar doesn't live very long, dies in 855, and his territory is eaten up by the Western and Eastern Frankish lands, and the Italy kind of breaks apart into small patchwork kingdoms. But and the crown goes to the Eastern Germanic kingdom and the Eastern German rulers. Now, because of this kind of split, there began to be a gradual disintegration of power among these Frankish rulers, and power began to grow among the nobility. So what we began to see is a development of feudalism began to take place, where nobility began to gain greater and greater influence at the cost of these kings. So, like, for example, in Germany, the kings began to have less and less power, but these nobles did. And so we start seeing the rise of electors who would choose the Holy Roman Emperor. In the kingdom of the Franks, we see the diminishment of the Frankish kings and at the cost of these Frankish nobles and these different houses that would compete for authority and power and the power control in France. The papacy seeks to try to manipulate these secular rulers in this disintegration, this time period, but it runs into its own problems, because now the aristocrats in Rome seek to try to usurp the Pope, steal power away from the Pope, and elect their own popes into office. And so there's corruption that shapes and causes a decline of papal influence as well. So into the 9th century and 10th century, we do see a great decline taking place within Western Christendom, and the rise of anarchy beginning to shape a lot of the livelihood of society. There's also attacks from without. So instead of internal troubles, there's also external troubles. You have the Magyars, a nomadic tribe who settled into Hungary, conducting raids against the Germanic kingdoms. You have the Emirate of Cordova gaining power and influence in Spain, and then as well as Viking raids that become prominent in this time period as well. So it's very common for a lot of Christians to view this time period as almost as the end of the world, and expecting that the year 1000 would be the end of the world and the return of Christ. So there was a huge expectation for that at the end of this period. So what is the legacy of Charlemagne's empire? Like I said, we had this political disintegration taking place into the 9th and 10th century. What we have to understand too is that even with this political disintegration, it doesn't mean that there was a religious disintegration as well. Yes, there were definitely problems and corruptions within the church in this time period, and as this painting will point out, and I'll tell you about it here in a second. But still, the Carolingian Renaissance, one with its drive in learning and its focus in writing and manuscript copying, laid a groundwork for intellectual development that will survive and thrive into the high and late Middle Ages. We also still see the encouragement of missions movement from Britain and Ireland, and those monk missionaries coming into Western Christendom will continue to be encouraged and inspiring and spreading Christianity into pagan lands and territories. And we see the blending of the religious and political offices, whether, looking at Charlemagne, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, managing the affairs of the church and the empire, as well as the papacy having its own lands and civil jurisdictions to manage. But regardless, because of these different factors, society is united religiously under the church more so than it is politically. And so this common culture appears whether you lived in the Germanic lands or lived in the Frankish lands or lived in somewhat northern Italy, though there are some differences. One, in a sense, can be considered a European Christian in any parts of the Frankish Empire. And so this would set the basis for a stable European society as we move into the high Middle Ages. Now, like I said, there is corruption and there are problems within the church. So, for example, like in this painting, they see here, this is the famous Cadaver Synod, I believe, of 897, in which Pope Formosus is dug out of his grave barely a month after he died, and put on trial for perjury and holding multiple offices by his rival Pope Stephen. You can see Pope Stephen pointing at Pope Formosus. The man standing in black is a deacon meant to represent and defend Pope Formosus. Ultimately, the Cadaver Synod is short-lived. Pope Formosus is struck from the record as ever being Pope, had his fingers torn off where his hands were kissed, and was thrown into the Tiber River. What's interesting is that his body did float up from the Tiber River and began to supposedly conduct miracles, in which then the people and aristocrats of Rome turned against Pope Stephen, had him arrested and imprisoned a couple months later, and then strangled to death. And then he was stricken from the records, and Pope Formosus was reapplied as Pope, and it became back and forth between these. But what it ultimately meant to show is the kind of the underpinning of how people viewed the spiritual world as well as the physical world in this time period and the implications of that. So there is still corruption. There's still problems within the church. We'll see that. But like I said, hopefully that you also see in this lecture too, is that there are positive lights, that there is still a focus on God's grace. There is still a focus on building up his church and his kingdom, educating the clergy. And there are positive aspects in church history, not just the crazy superstitious and the mystical as well. Well, next time we will look at the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Church, and hope to see you and hope for y'all to join me then. Talk to you later.